On a Friday afternoon in May 2025, the White House quietly released a document that sent shockwaves through every space agency, university, research institution, and observatory that had ever partnered with NASA. It was the Trump administration's detailed fiscal year 2026 budget request, and what it proposed for the agency that put humans on the moon, launched the Hubble Space Telescope, sent rovers to Mars, and carried humanity's first message to the stars was not a restructuring. It was not a pivot. It was, in the words of Casey Dreyer, chief of space policy at the Planetary Society, going out of business kind of cuts. A 24% reduction in NASA's overall budget from $24.8 billion to $18.8 billion, the largest single-year proposed cut in the agency's history. And buried inside that top-line number was a figure that stopped scientists mid-sentence when they read it. A 47% cut to NASA's science budget. Nearly half of all NASA science funding, gone in a single fiscal year. The proposal would have canceled or defunded more than 40 active and planned missions, terminated thousands of research grants, and shrunk the agency's workforce to levels not seen since 1961, the year before John Glenn first orbited the Earth. The question that every person who has ever looked up at the night sky and felt something needed to ask was simple and devastating. How did it come to this? To understand what the budget proposal actually meant in concrete terms, you need to look at the specific missions it targeted, because this was not a cut to bureaucratic overhead or administrative spending. This was a cut to active spacecraft in flight, to missions already launched and producing scientific returns, to probes that cannot be turned back on once they are switched off. The budget proposal called for the immediate termination of New Horizons, the spacecraft that spent 9.5 years crossing the solar system to photograph Pluto in stunning detail in 2015 and has since been exploring the outer Kuiper Belt, the ancient icy debris field at the edge of our solar neighborhood. It called for shutting down Juno, the probe that has been orbiting Jupiter since 2016 and has fundamentally transformed humanity's understanding of the gas giant's interior structure and magnetic environment. It targeted Mars Odyssey and Maven, two orbiters that have been circling Mars for years, studying its atmosphere, mapping its surface, and serving as critical communications relays for rovers on the ground. It canceled Mars Sample Return, the $7 billion flagship program that was supposed to collect the rock samples. Perseverance has already drilled out of Jezero Crater and bring them back to Earth for laboratory analysis, the most scientifically ambitious Mars mission ever conceived. And those were only some of the 40-plus missions on the list. The full scope of what the proposal targeted represented decades of scientific investment and international collaboration that cannot be reconstructed by pressing a restart button. What happened next was something that has no clear precedent in the history of American space policy. The Trump administration did not wait for Congress to approve the budget. According to multiple whistleblowers who came forward to congressional investigators and whose testimony was compiled in a detailed report released by the House Science Committee in April 2026, senior political appointees at NASA, including then Chief of Staff Brian Hughes and then Senior Advisor Ryan Whitley, ordered agency staff to begin implementing the fiscal year 2026 budget proposal immediately. Without any congressional authorization to do so, programs were defunded. Contracts were canceled. Staff were directed to begin shutdown procedures for missions that Congress had not voted to end. A presidential budget request, violation of the constitutional separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches. Yet the implementation proceeded. The Planetary Society estimated that the equivalent of the proposed budget cuts were being executed in real time, not as law, but as administrative action, before a single congressional vote had been cast. The workforce damage was simultaneous and severe. DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, led until late May 2025 by Elon Musk, arrived at NASA, facilities to review contracts and spending, and what followed was a sequence of layoffs and departure incentives that collectively removed a significant fraction of the people who actually run the missions. Probationary employees were the first to go, notified to prepare for dismissal at NASA centers, including Johnson Space Center in Houston, which manages human spaceflight. Then came 3 offices at NASA headquarters in Washington, gutted in a single day in March 2025. Including 2 senior policy divisions and engineering personnel whose institutional knowledge about mission safety had been built over careers spanning decades. By July 2025, roughly 1/5 of NASA's entire civil servant workforce had taken voluntary departure options, buyouts, and early retirements to avoid the uncertainty of what came next. A whistleblower quoted in the Senate Commerce Committee's report described watching it happen in real time. NASA is losing our future workforce. It is really heartbreaking to see the future of NASA just disappearing. The safety dimension of the workforce losses is not abstract, and the people raising the alarm about it are not outsiders. Former astronauts and senior engineers who spent their careers at the agency began speaking publicly about what the departures mean for mission safety, specifically pointing to the lessons that NASA learned at devastating cost from the Challenger disaster in 1986 and the Columbia disaster in 2003. Both of those catastrophes were later attributed in part to institutional failures, to a culture where dissenting safety opinions were suppressed, where the people who knew something was wrong did not feel safe saying so loudly enough to stop a launch. After Columbia, NASA spent years rebuilding its technical authority system, the formal structure that gives engineers and safety officers the institutional standing to halt a mission if they believe it is unsafe. That system depends on people with experience, credibility, and institutional memory to function. The NASA Voyager Declaration, a formal dissent document signed by hundreds of NASA civil servants, explicitly objected to the dismantling of the technical authority system as one of its primary concerns. What could be more dangerous at NASA? One former senior engineer asked publicly. Even if you didn't cancel any missions, you're going to have a big problem. It's just a matter of time. Congress did eventually act, and the outcome was a partial but significant rejection of the proposed cuts. In January 2026, a bipartisan spending bill passed both chambers and was sent to President Trump for signature, allocating $24.4 billion to NASA for fiscal year 2026, a figure that rejected the 47% science cut and instead delivered approximately a 1.1% reduction to the science budget, rather than the catastrophic slash the administration had proposed. The Planetary Society, while acknowledging the legislation as a real victory over the proposed cuts, noted that it still represented a reduction from the prior year's levels, the programs which had already been damaged by months of illegal implementation would not simply return to full health because a bill passed, and that the workforce losses, the engineers, scientists, and mission managers who had already left, would not come back because a funding level was restored on paper. Institutional knowledge, once it walks out the door with the person who holds it, does not return when the budget is restored. The hardware might still be there. The people who know how to operate it may not be. The international dimension of what was proposed is one of the least discussed aspects of the crisis, and it deserves direct attention. NASA does not operate in isolation. Virtually every major mission it flies involves partners. The European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, and space agencies from dozens of other nations that contribute instruments, launch services, data relay capabilities, and scientific personnel. The Webb Space Telescope, which has revolutionized astronomy since its launch in late 2021, was built with major European contributions. The Mars orbiters targeted for cancellation carry instruments built by international teams who contributed scientific expertise and engineering labor to a shared mission. When the Trump budget proposal was circulated in 2025, it did not simply threaten American science programs. It threatened the credibility of the United States as a reliable partner for any future collaborative space mission. Why would any foreign space agency commit budget, engineering resources, and political capital to a joint mission with NASA if the American government might simply cancel its own participation mid-program because a new administration decided to change priorities? The damage to that trust is not repaired by a continuing resolution. It accumulates over years, and its full cost is measured in the partnerships that quietly stop being proposed before they are ever announced. The political logic behind the cuts, stated explicitly in White House budget documents and administration communications, involves two distinct arguments. The first is fiscal, that NASA, like all federal agencies, must contribute to reducing the national deficit, and that programs like the Space Launch System, a heavy-lift rocket developed at a cost that ran billions over budget and years behind schedule, represent exactly the kind of legacy government spending that should be eliminated in favor of cheaper, more efficient private alternatives. There is a legitimate version of this argument. The SLS did cost more and take longer than originally projected. Commercial launch providers, including SpaceX, have dramatically reduced the cost per kilogram to orbit. Transition toward commercially provided launch services is a reasonable long-term strategic direction. These are fair points that have been made by people across the political spectrum who follow space policy seriously. The second argument is directional. The administration wants NASA to focus on Mars, not the Moon, reflecting Elon Musk's personal vision for humanity's future as a multi-planetary species. The budget proposal included a $1 billion boost for Mars-focused human exploration programs, even while cutting everything else, suggesting not an agency being destroyed, but an agency being forcibly redirected. The problem with applying both arguments simultaneously to a single budget cycle is that the redirection requires destroying the institution before rebuilding it in the new direction. And institutions, particularly institutions that depend on accumulated human expertise, do not survive that process intact. You cannot fire a fifth of your workforce, cancel 40 active missions, defund the research grants that train the next generation of scientists, eliminate the safety oversight architecture that prevents human spaceflight catastrophes, and then expect to have a functional space agency on the other side of the fiscal year, ready to send humans to Mars on a new timeline. The hardware ambition and the human infrastructure required to execute it are not separable. One does not survive the elimination of the other. What NASA represents, what it has represented for 60 years, is something that the budget documents do not capture, and that the political arguments on both sides of the funding debate tend to skip past entirely. It is the institutional embodiment of the decision, made by a democratic society, that some questions are worth pursuing regardless of their immediate commercial return. What is the universe made of? How did the solar system form? Are we alone? Where did the water on Earth come from? How do stars die? Whether those questions are worth the money is a value question, not a technical one, and different people answer it differently. But the institutional capacity to pursue those questions, the workforce, the mission pipeline, the international partnerships, the accumulated expertise from 60 years of doing things that had never been done before, is not something that can be rebuilt quickly once it is dismantled. The Voyager probes are still transmitting from interstellar space. The Webb telescope is still photographing the first galaxies. The Perseverance rover is still drilling cores from ancient Martian lake beds. The institution that built all of those things is the same institution whose future workforce a whistleblower described as just disappearing. The question of whether it can be preserved, redirected and sustained through the political turbulence of 2025 and 2026, is one that will define what kind of civilization the United States chooses to be, not just in space, but in the world.